Chair Robbins moves House File 3524 be laid over for possible inclusion in the omnibus tax bill. Do you have an amendment? No amendment. Okay, very good. Chair Robbins.
Good morning, Mr. Chair and members. I am bringing forward 3524, which would do federal conformity for no tax on overtime. And I think this is really important, members, and I'm happy to say, as the last bill seemed to have broad bipartisan support, this bill at the federal level was supported by both Donald Trump and Kamala Harris. So I hope we can get bipartisan support on this as well. So I think that the most important thing to talk about is just that we have so many workers who work so hard, and we want to encourage their productivity and them staying in the labor force here in Minnesota. This particularly affects our border communities, and if we provide this federal conformity, it makes it easier to file their taxes. They'll be getting commensurate benefit at the state tax that they also are now getting on the federal benefit, and it lets them keep more of their hard-earned money and gets more money into the economy. So it's a win-win-win, and I hope the committee will support the bill.
Okay, do you have some testifiers on this one? No. So we'll probably have the testimony, and they can address both 3524 and 3525 at the same time. Any questions on this bill for Chair Robbins? Representative Smith.
Maybe just a quick clarification, Chair. Do you want questions all at once on these bills as together? You're doing testimony together, so I'm just curious how you want questions on these bills.
I'd say let's wait till the next one and then hit them both,
Okay.
if that's okay.
Sure.
Yeah, they're very kind of similar type of things. Okay, so why don't we then, Representative Robbins renews her motion to lay over House File 3525 for possible inclusion in the omnibus tax bill. Okay, so now Representative Robbins moves, I'll minus the bill here somewhere. Oh, there it is, okay. Thank you. Representative Robbins moves House File 3525, and there is an amendment. Would you like to move the A2 amendment to get the bill in the shape you like? Oh, geez, picked up the wrong one. I'm sorry. No, I'm sorry. Didn't mean to surprise you like that. No amendments.
No amendments.
Representative Robbins moves House File 3525, and we're not going to be voting on it, but for possible inclusion. Please present your bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members. This is a similar bill. It's federal conformity to the no tax on tips provisions of the federal law. Again, it keeps the tax benefit to working people in the hospitality industry and other tipped industries, similar to the benefit they're getting at the federal level. It also simplifies their tax preparation and keeps more money in their pocket. Members, we hear every day from our small businesses, from our employees, how they are getting hammered, and we have the opportunity to give them an opportunity for tax relief that really will hit working families, people in the trades. For the one bill, nurses, first responders. In this bill, it's young workers, a lot of women who are in the server industry, part-time employees, entry-level employees. These are all people working hard, trying to get a leg up, and this is a way we can provide tax relief.
Okay, thank you. I think before we take member questions, we will take member questions. Let's go through the testifiers here, and so the members can wrap it up with their questions. Sandra Weiss, help me out here. Weiss, okay. Sandra Weiss from the Finnish Bistro. Where's that?
Home Carter in St. Paul, sir.
I'll check it out.
I highly recommend.
Okay. Please state your name and who you represent for the record, please.
My name is Sandra Weiss. Chair Davids.
You got good eyes.
Okay. And Co-Chair Gomez, thank you for having me today. My name is Sandra Weiss. I was born in Minnesota and own the Finnish Bistro on Como Avenue in St. Paul for 13 years this Friday. I did it. I employ 25 people, and my staff are my absolute top priority. I really care about my staff. It's the thing that drives me. So I support House File 3524 and House File 3525, and the previous one as well. Staff can keep more of their earnings. they need it. Minnesota has no tip credit, and tipped employees earn well over the minimum wage. Protecting take-home advantage also makes hospitality a more attractive and sustainable career choice. Despite our industry's love and pride of Minnesota, the trends of the last 5 years are unsustainable. We have unique challenges and have been fairly good at toughing it out until now. The unbearable costs, the stacking restrictions specific to hospitality, and the lack of care, sometimes it feels that way for business, has shown us to keep going is nearly impossible these days. We need new language and laws around tipping. Minnesota is, in addition to what has been mentioned, Minnesota is one of only 3 states with crippling tip pooling limitations. Employers get no tip credit. For wages, we get to provide for the source of those wages, but we get no credit for that. Reform would not reduce worker pay. All funds still go to the employees, but allows front of the house and back of the house equity and operation fairness for everyone that creates the customer experience. I think a lot of people would be shocked to find out that only the person who gets handed the cash or the receipt is the person who owns the money. It doesn't get distributed anywhere else. And we want them to have more money. We want equity as well. We need to carve out this, for this hospitality industry with the junk fees as well. That's future things. But we need you, and we need long-term partners in the legislation to build sensible policy for our industry, or this year could break us. These bills are meaningful first steps as we continue in recovery mode. The law was framed on consumer transparency, which we agree, but it doesn't reflect the reality of our operations, and we need all the tools we can to provide benefits and competitive wages. Thank you, and I'm available for questions.
I have a question. What's your menu like? Do you ever have meatloaf?
Yes, it's 8 pages long.
Do you have meatloaf?
Yes, and real mashed
Well, see,
potatoes.
I love meatloaf. I know not why.
We have elk meatballs, too.
Ooh. Okay, I'm gonna come see you. Okay, questions for the witness? The gentleman from Lyon.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And just to the testifier, could you told the committee that you have about 25 employees. Could you kind of just talk about their demographics? Like, are they men? Are they women? Are they, what's kind of some of their backgrounds so we kind of understand like how and who this provision would potentially impact?
It's about 50-50,
Ms. Weiss?
men and women. Can you hear me? Sorry, it's about 50-50 men and women. There's college students. There are, back of the house, we have more long-term employees. Front of the house, kind of just as college gig. But increasingly, the front of the house averages $34 an hour, and the back of the house averages 19 to 21. And that's the tip disparity. We don't have a tip credit, and it's increasing. The back of the house sees the front of the house count their cash, and they need it. They all need to make their rent. They want to have their take-home earnings, but there is a disparity that is very obvious right now.
Chair Swazinski.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So would you say, it sounds like to the testifier that it may be maybe kind of a secondary, either it's a secondary job or it's even just their only job, but they have, they're students, or would that be considered correct?
The back of the house
Ms.
typically
Weiss?
has, oh, pardon me, I can't,
Sorry,
thank
it's fine.
you,
You're doing
Mr. Swazinski.
It's okay.
The back of the house typically has more than one job, and the front of the house with school, they need something, they need to take their tips home because they are putting themselves through school at the same time. So full-time student, part-time barista, they can't afford. The tip credit will greatly help them.
Chair Swazinski.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And then you said that your restaurant was a Finnish
Yes,
bistro.
yes, like
Right.
country of Finland, not like finish line.
Did you know that, Mr. Chair,
Chair
just to
Swazinski.
comment from a historical standpoint, that the ancient sailors and the folks that used to sail the high seas used to attribute that they did a lot of tracking and that most mermaids came from Finland? Did you know that? Because they're
And Santa
Finnish.
Claus, too.
This is the Science Committee.
That's our discussion of mermaids.
Ms. Weiss. That's, I never saw that before, 34 years. Okay, Chair Swazinski.
Good.
Okay, you sure are. Okay, Chair Gomez.
Yeah, thanks. I'm going to give some other comments later, but you're testifying in favor of the bill?
I am.
Okay, so you talked about this disparity between the hourly wage of tipped workers who work in the front of house, around $34 an hour, and then the folks who work in the back of the house, both of whom are delivering a customer experience, as you said, make 19 to 21. So those tipped workers making 34 an hour, getting a Minnesota subtraction on their income taxes, I mean, that would make that disparity in those, the wages worse.
Well, I think having.
Ms. Weiss?
Oh, pardon me, Chair Davids. I think having the tax credit it's not about punishing the people in the front or the back. It's making it, a meaningful step towards making them more even. And so I misspoke when I was thinking about, my printer didn't work this morning, and so I have my notes. I'm sorry. I was thinking about the tipped minimum wage with worker protection, and it was I lost track of, I'm sorry. Guaranteed wage support. That was what I was thinking about earlier, sending, okay, guaranteed wage support. So right now, they're uneven, but if we have an earned tip credit, then I was talking about the earned tip credit. I skipped a part, and so I'm confusing everyone. I'm sorry. But a guaranteed wage would show that we don't get as an employer, we don't get any credit for the income at this time. So it doesn't show as income for my business when somebody makes $34 an hour. They always make over minimum wage, and so I'm not making a clear thought here. I'm sorry. So that we just needed additional guaranteed wage law that's not about the one that's presented here.
Chair Gomez. Okay, thank you very much. Any other questions for the witness? Okay, we will go to thank you very much, and you'll be seeing me. Nan Madden, where's Nan Madden? She's right here. With the Minnesota Budget Project Director, Minnesota Council of Nonprofits. Welcome to the committee. If you could please state your name and who you represent for the record, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members. My name is Nan Madden. I'm Director of the Minnesota Budget Project. The Minnesota Budget Project is a program of the Minnesota Council of Nonprofits. Our mission is to identify and advance public policies to make Minnesota a place where everyone can thrive, regardless of who they are or where they live. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today with concerns about House File 3524 and House File 3525, which would provide limited tax deductions for tip income and overtime pay. We certainly agree that addressing the economic challenges facing everyday Minnesotans should be a top priority for this legislative session, and I appreciate Representative Robbins pointing to those challenges. But these bills are not a good solution. These elements of the federal H.R. 1 are poorly designed in that they violate key tax principles, they reach only a small number of working people, and they are not well targeted to folks struggling to get by. The high cost of conforming to them would threaten affordable health care and other public services that Minnesotans count on. Our first concern with these bills is that they create special carve-outs for particular types of income. This creates winners and losers and violates the principle of horizontal equity, which seeks to have similar tax treatment for people with similar incomes and economic circumstances. Tipped employees and folks who work overtime do valuable work, but so do grocery store cashiers, childcare providers, and many other workers that do not receive tips. Someone who works for a company that offers or requires overtime is not more worthy of concern than a worker at a company that doesn't have overtime. These provisions will have a limited reach, and only a small share of the country's workers will see any benefit. Analysis by the Nonpartisan Tax Policy Center estimates that nationally, only 3% of U.S. households will benefit from H.R. 1's tax deduction for tips, and only 9% would benefit from the tax deduction for overtime pay. These tax deductions are not well targeted to those struggling paycheck to paycheck. They do little to nothing for the lowest income workers, and at the same time, they are available to households fairly high up the income scale. The tip exemption is available to households with incomes up to $550,000 for married filing joint, and $400,000 for other status. These kinds of tax provisions were more of a sideshow than the main event of H.R. 1. The provisions on tips, overtime, the special carve-out for seniors, and the auto loan deduction taken together make up only a very small share of H.R. 1's total tax cuts, and at the federal level, they are temporary. However, the cost to Minnesota of replicating these provisions would be high. The combined cost from these two bills is roughly $500 million per biennium. They would put the state into deficit in 28-29 and make it harder to protect essential services like health care and food support that improve the lives of struggling Minnesotans but were dramatically cut by H.R. 1. Thank you.
So I'll put you down as a maybe. No, your testimony was very clear, and we appreciate that as a committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Questions for Ms. Madden? Okay, thank you very much. Before we go to Mr. Bernstein and Haveman, I've been neglecting the department here. I apologize. Did you want to testify on these bills so we can go back, or? You're okay right now? Yeah, you are. Yeah, okay. Thank you very much, Ms. Bears. Okay, let's go to Mr. Bernstein. If you could please state your name and who you represent for the record, please. And we hope the Melrose FFA has a good day.
Chair David's members, Chair David, Chair Gomez, Representative Robbins, members of the committee. My name is Eric Bernstein. I'm the director of We Make Minnesota. We're a coalition of labor and community groups united in support of a fair tax code sufficient to fund Minnesota's public investment needs. I'm sandwiched here between Nan Madden and Mark Haveman of the Center for Fiscal Excellence. I'm afraid I'm going to repeat some things that have been said and might be said again, so I'll try and go quick. But thanks for the opportunity to share our perspective on both HF3524 and 3525, which would conform to federal provisions exempting overtime and tipped income from taxation. We oppose these policies because they're regressive, arbitrary, and they will weaken the state's ability to adequately fund vital public investments in healthcare, education, and other priorities. The combined cost to Minnesota, as has been stated, is over $500 million during the 28-29 biennium, which would preempt important funding for healthcare, education, other needs. Like all income tax cuts, these costly carve-outs would also be regressive, with more benefits going to those with more earnings. But perhaps more importantly, exempting specific forms of income violates the principle of horizontal equity, which Ms. Madden mentioned. That holds that households with similar earnings should be treated similarly by the tax code. So in this case, a lower income worker making overtime is no worse off than a lower income worker, or earning everything on a fixed salary. And so we shouldn't cut taxes for one and not the other. Doing so not only treats folks unequally, but it also introduces the possibility of gamesmanship, where employers and business owners could reconfigure compensation in order to avoid taxes, and so that's something we don't want to do. And so although the political appeal of these ideas is understandable, policies like this introduce complexity and inequity, and they can create distrust in our tax code because people see that others are being treated differently. That's bad for Minnesota. And to Representative Wiener's point earlier, I don't agree that brackets make our tax code complex, but we do have a complex tax code. I appreciated that comment. And exemptions like this would make it worse, especially if the federal government's provision fades out in 2028, and ours would continue as this bill would dictate. In closing, I'd just like to say we do truly appreciate the opportunity to comment on these proposals. Representative Robbins, you mentioned that both Donald Trump and Kamala Harris endorsed the tip exemption proposal during 2024. In my opinion, that doesn't make it a good idea. So this was a welcome chance to highlight some problematic tax policy thinking that exists on both sides of the aisle. Too often, we like to score political points by delivering targeted benefits to one group over another, or we let talking points shape our tax code. Our coalition feels that's a mistake. Whether you want generally more taxes and public investment or less, uneven proposals like this, they introduce undesirable complexity and inequity. So regardless of the level of taxation that we would prefer, let's strive for simplicity and fairness here in Minnesota. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bernstein. I apologize to Chair you. Just a second here. To Chair Joachim, I believe when Ms. Madden was up here, you want to be recognized. So do you want her to come back or general comments or?
Actually, no, Mr. Chair, it was actually a question for nonpartisan staff in the committee.
Oh, go ahead,
Thank you.
go ahead.
Oh, I just wanted to go over the revenue notes for both, just so I understand how much they cost, and maybe a further question to the author about why the phase-out's so high.
Ms. Templin?
Mr. Chair, Representative Joaquin, yes, there are two revenue estimates. The first one is House File 3524 for the subtraction for overtime. This has an estimated revenue reduction of $365.9 million in fiscal '27 and a estimated revenue reduction of $197.3 in '28 and $203.1 million in fiscal '29. And the impact would be to the general fund. And then there is a revenue estimate for the tip subtraction. That is House File 3525, and that has an estimated revenue impact of $126 million in '27 and about $69 million in '28 and '29. I should mention that the revenue impact in the first year is front-loaded because it includes 2 fiscal years, and that is why you see the doubling up in fiscal '27.
Chair Joachim? Thank you. Thank you. Any questions for Mr. Bernstein? I was going to ask a question if you support House File 3127, but that'd probably be inappropriate. I'll talk to you later.
I would say I think it makes sense for us to try to, I think I appreciated your comments on it.
Well, talk all you'd like. Talk all you'd like.
Brian, you want to come back up? Or? Yeah, no, I mean, I think this is sort of a personal opinion, but, the salt cap deduction, as was noted, was there's a lot of feelings on both sides of the aisle about that. And in this case, I do think that it was a benefit to higher tax states, states that were doing more to fund public programs, to allow folks to deduct against the federal government. The federal government has a lot less strict limitations on their spending. They can print money and spend it, which we can't do. So any sort of easing of those structures, I think, is positive for states like Minnesota. And the other thing is there's research that shows that the salt cap deduction was associated with higher taxes and lower fees, taxes being generally more progressive than fees. And so not just allowing states to fund these important programs that we fund here at state and local government, but also doing so in a more equitable way. And so that was a positive thing. And we were, I was sad to see that cap placed, even though some people would say the benefits are regressive. They go more to higher income earners, but I think creating more fiscal space there is good for states like Minnesota that are trying to fund important programs.
Thank you, Mr. Bernstein. Any questions for Mr. Bernstein? Okay, we will now go to Mark Haveman. Am I close?
You got it.
All right. Please state your name and who you represent for the record, please, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, Chair Gomez, members. My name is Mark Haveman. I'm the Executive Director of the Minnesota Center for Fiscal Excellence. We are a research and education organization in support of sound tax policy, efficient spending, and accountable government, now in our 100th year as of today. Just for a little context for my remarks, well, first of all, I'm reminded of the famous last line in the movie Good Will Hunting, "Son of a gun, they stole my line," which applies to the testimony of the folks who were just before me. But we typically don't get involved in levels of taxation and spending, believing that our organization was founded on the idea that citizens through their elected officials are responsible for determining the level of government they want to support with their tax dollars. What our organization has always been about is making sure that the revenue systems that are in place respect good principles of tax policy and public finance, and the spending that's done is accountable, transparent, and does what it's supposed to do. So for this reason, I'll be focusing my testimony on some important policy considerations in considering this bill, which have largely been articulated already. Tax fairness is a prime one here. It creates problems from the fundamental principle of tax fairness, regardless of how one chooses to define tax fairness. You've heard the discussion about horizontal equity, treating equals equally. It violates horizontal equity by treating workers with identical incomes differently based solely on how they're paid. And I think these are, as always, has already been suggested as well, these are practical, non-theoretical reasons to care about this. It harms tax system integrity in the eyes of many taxpayers. It legitimizes more of these types of carve-out treatments. And it's economically distorting by creating incentives to restructure compensation toward tips and even where tipping makes no particular economic or social sense. Now, we have lots of examples in the state of not treating income equals equally. But these actions are typically predicated on a policy reason or rationale to deviate from this principle. And in this case, I think it's hard to come up with a policy rationale to override the baseline presumption of equal treatment. The one that has been suggested is the benefit to low and moderate income workers, and we can certainly appreciate that and understand the reasons for putting this bill forward. The problem is that there are some unexpected results with regards to who actually benefits and how much from this policy. The Yale Budget Lab has actually studied the distributional effects of no taxes on tips at the federal level. They concluded that only about 1/3 of the bottom quintile of taxpayers who tipped income would actually benefit from an in-tax deduction for tips. 2/3 wouldn't benefit at all because they don't owe any income tax to begin with. They also found the average size of tax cuts rises steeply with income for two reasons. First of all, higher income tipped workers generally have more tip to deduct, and that the income's progressive rate structure means a dollar of deduction generates more tax savings for someone with a higher tax rate than a lower tax rate. This average tax cut for bottom quintile families of 1/3 who benefit, but 1/3 of whom benefit, was $200, and the top quintile had the highest average tax cut among beneficiaries, many multiple times higher. When you consider Minnesota's conformity to the federal standard deduction, the existence of our dependent exemptions combined with our own highly progressive rate structure, it suggests that the Yale's Budget Lab findings would likely apply to Minnesota, and perhaps even a slightly larger percentage of Minnesota low-income households would not benefit from this policy. My last comment concerns administration, and I yield to the Department of Revenue on this. The federal government, when they did put this bill in place, did provide a number of anti-abuse provisions. One was the specified service, trade, or business rules, sectors which are expressly ineligible for the deduction. There are occupational lock-in provisions preventing new businesses from deciding we're going to be a tip business as well. And there's income caps. However, the final regulations on the SSTB rules, which are the primary anti-avoidance mechanism, have not been issued to my knowledge, and maybe the Department of Revenue can correct me. But as a result, Minnesota would be conforming to a federal framework that is still under construction. The Department of Revenue would inherit an enforcement environment where some key definitional questions remain open. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, sir. Any questions for Mr. Haveman? Representative Anderson.
Thank you. Mr. Haven, how do you feel about the pass-through entity tax bill that was?
Go for it.
Hi?
Go for it.
Mr. Haveman, Chair Gomez.
Thanks. Could we just, keep to this bill if we're during consideration of this bill? I know we
Yeah,
have a
we
latitude in
probably-
taxes, but maybe we should
Probably should.
do that.
Okay.
I'm done.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I have two on the list. If we need more, we'll have more. Representative Smith. And then Representative Gomez, you can wrap things up.
Thanks.
Thank you, Chair. I think one of the hardest parts about our job here as representatives is policy that is popular when people first hear it, but potentially is harmful underneath that popular veneer. And I will be honest here at the beginning, I think both of these bills are that. So I have a series of questions for you, Representative Robbins, about this to try to get to the bottom of why I think these bills are not going to help workers as it was presented, or at least not in the way that you have presented it. So bear with me, Chair. I do have a a series of questions here. My first is simply the cost of these bills. Your Senate author, Senator Housley, when asked about this, almost $390 million cost in this first fiscal year, where she was going to find this money in our budget. Quote, "We have the next 10 weeks to work out where the money would be coming from." Now, that was in a press conference, but we're making policy in the tax committee. Where are you going to pay for these massive spending bills?
Chair Robbins?
Well, that is the work of the committee, and that's why it's being laid over, as you well know. But I would suggest that there was $100 million in the budget last year for housing stabilization. That program is closed, and we could start there. There's another $9 billion in fraud that we are finding in the fraud committee. So I think we could find ways to find the money if we had the will.
Representative Smith?
I'll be returning to the fraud committee, but I heard you say I'm going to take from funds that might help stabilize housing. I don't think that's a great thing.
I'm sorry, I just want to correct the record. I said from a program that was closed but is still in the budget. The program no longer exists.
Thank you for the clarification,
Oh,
Representative Smith.
of course, but those decisions will have to be made. But let's move on to the heart of the bill. And I'm going to take them separately. So I want to start with House File 3524, which is the overtime pay. Could you just describe, especially in 1.8, what does it mean by the qualified overtime pay will be deduced? Because I've talked to people who receive overtime and they're a bit confused about what would actually be exempt and what wouldn't be in that overtime pay.
Representative Robbins?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I will defer to nonpartisan if I make a mistake, but my understanding is it's following the Fair Labor Standards Act, so what qualifies is the amount when you say time and a half, the half portion is what is qualified.
Representative Smith?
Yeah, I think that's correct, and I think that's good to clarify, because I've talked to constituents who are like, this is great, they made $30 an hour after overtime, their $45 an hour is going to be deducted. It's just that $15. It's not every overtime dollar you make is going to be deducted. I also, and this will be a theme here, we're treating workers at the same level very, very differently. Specifically in this bill, I want to ask the question, imagine two workers that work 60 hours a week. One works 40 hours at a job that he gets paid overtime, and then 20 hours he gets for overtime, so 60 hours there. Another one is working two jobs, 40 hours in one job, and then maybe on the weekends takes another job. Does this bill treat those two 60 hours of work, let's say they're the same exact pay, does this bill treat those two workers differently?
Chair Robbins?
Yes. And I would just like to point out, members, on this broad discussion of carve-outs for certain types of income, that, I hear you, but I've been fighting for broad tax reform and tax cuts that would affect everyone for 8 years now. So if you want to instead just lower the lowest tax rate, our lowest tax rate in this state is 5.35%. That is higher than the highest tax rate in 30 other states. We are completely uncompetitive. So what I'm trying to do here is help a group of workers who get overtime, they are working extra, they get, it's a productivity thing, it's also a competitiveness thing, especially along our border communities. And I wish we were lowering taxes for everyone. That would be my ideal. I agree. But that's not where we're at. And conforming with federal tax policy on no tax on tips and no tax on overtime helps a substantial number of hardworking, middle-class workers in Minnesota, and it's a place to start to get more money in workers' pockets.
Representative Smith?
So the answer to my question is no. It treats those two workers very, very differently, who are working the same amount for the same amount of money. It's selecting one particular point. And in choosing to bring these tax reforms to this committee, you are choosing to not do other things. I asked our nonpartisan staff to tell me if we didn't do any of these, the tips or the overtime deduction, and we just put all that money into the refundable child tax credit, we could improve that credit to all Minnesota families, which is a refundable credit, by $500 per child. So this is a choice you're making on the bills that you're bringing to this committee. To be frank, well, people who work overtime don't do so voluntarily. The vast majority of them are told you are working overtime or you will lose your job or you will lose your contract. The 1937 Fair Labor Standards Act, which you mentioned, was brought in account because we want people not to work overtime. We don't want them to be overworked. So why are taxpayers now being asked to subsidize employers who are forcing their workers to work overtime and work long hours? Makes no sense to me to incentivize those employers and to put that price tag on Minnesota taxpayers. I want to move on to House File 3754, which is the TIPS one, which has potentially gained more attention popularly and in our political discourse. I want to ask first, you
You
mentioned
mean
that
House File 3525?
it's 3754? Is that what it is? Oh, excuse me.
And to your previous comments, Representative Smith, I'm cutting back, I'm kind of old, so I'm just working half days now, 12 hours a day, just so.
I'm happy you're able to.
Yes,
I would like
yes.
most Minnesotans to not have to
Yes.
work overtime and be able to retire. On the food tips exemption, you are the chair, I believe, of the Fraud and Oversight Committee. In this bill, do you have guardrails for high-earning folks, lawyers, people who help with financial information, stockbrokers, knowing this deduction is out here and asking for, let's say, $25,000 in tips per year for their services and using that as a deduction?
Representative Robbins.
It's illegal.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My understanding is it's conforming to the federal guardrails, and that is what's in place. Certainly, if you have additional ideas, I would welcome that, because I am all about people not abusing the system.
Representative Smith?
So, let's just say, a stockbroker says, I'm doing financial services for you, and then just on the invoice puts, tips, 10% or whatever. It doesn't change the bottom number, but moves it around. Could they report that on their taxes as tax-exempt income?
Representative Robbins.
Under the federal standards currently that you mentioned?
Representative Robbins.
No. The federal standards currently require that it's in industries where tip income has already been traditional. So hospitality, transportation, there's a list somewhere, I can't quite remember, but I have it somewhere, I can find it. But it would not be in an industry where tip income has not been the norm.
Representative Smith.
Okay, so if a manager at a hotel started taking their or a director, you have a Hospitality Minnesota letter of support here, which on their board includes directors of places like Sheraton and Hyatt. Let's say one of those directors started taking, part of their salary in tips. They're in a hospitality industry. Would that be allowable under this deduction?
Representative Robbins.
No.
Representative Smith.
I'm not so sure that there won't be loopholes found as you are. I'm glad you are sure, but I'm simply not as sure about that. I also wanted to ask about simplification, because you mentioned that this is going to simplify tax preparation for workers. I think maybe for folks who have or are able to afford various services to help them file their taxes, maybe this will help because it's another deduction for them. But will it help, let's say, a waiter at our local diner who has to keep track of her tips, or the business operations manager at that small business who has to keep track of tips for recording purposes?
Representative Robbins.
Yes.
Representative Smith.
You think
Representative Smith, how many more questions you got? I got a whole bunch of people on here. We got another bill.
I got questions. These are good questions to ask, because this is how this will work out in the real world.
How many more questions do you have?
3-ish?
Representative Smith.
But I would say your very quick question of yes is I don't think so. I think if I'm talking to a friend of mine who, does waitressing, trying to keep track of all of her tips to make sure that she gets particular exemptions is going to be extremely cumbersome to make sure that they get this credit, where it won't be cumbersome for other areas who are able to afford it, or other people who are available to do it. But let's talk about
Chair.
actually hourly workers, because we
Representative
talked.
Robbins to that point?
Yes, to that point, Mr. Chair, I've talked to plenty of workers in hospitality industry, and they are excited about this because they're already keeping track of their tips for the federal portion, and so that they will get a commensurate credit at the state level. They're already doing it. So it is not added complexity. It's actually making it less complex because then the state will be aligned with the federal. So they're all, I've talked to lots of people in hospitality industries who are very much hoping we get this done.
Representative Smith.
So I want to talk about this area, again, in this particular area of tips of treating workers differently. Again, we heard some versions of this previously, but a tipped worker at the front of house who is earning tips and a line cook at the back who is not earning tips, or let's say the food truck delivery person who delivers the food, who is all are working at similar wages, are treated differently. One of their sources of income is now tax deductible, while the other two are not. And then expand that out to other industries, even within the same food industry. Fast food workers, the person who's at McDonald's, they don't receive tips, and so their low-wage hourly commission is not going to be tax deductible under this. In fact, a very low percentage of low-wage workers work for tips in the United States. Those who earn less than $25 per hour, it's only about 5.1% are in traditionally tipped occupations, which means that this does nothing for 94.9% of the workforce who's working low wage, under $25 an hour wages. And even the same job. Imagine a waitress at Denny's who's getting tipped based on Grand Slams, which I love, but they are certainly cheaper than a waitress who's serving at a high-end restaurant where plates are $75. Their tips are going to be different, and it's going to be treated differently at the tax perspective. And I don't think that's something that we want.
Mr. Chair?
Oh,
Sorry, is there a question? I'm
To the
sorry.
point.
no, you can go there, and then I'll have a closing comment.
Representative Robbins.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I understand that they're treated differently, but that is what happened, and no one seemed to care when the COVID had happened and all our restaurant workers were shut down. They were disproportionately impacted. And this does, I admit, give them a bit of an advantage over workers who do not get tips. But my concern is that we're not giving tax relief to anyone. If you guys wanted to cut the lowest tax rate, I would take that deal in a heartbeat. But we are fighting to give any amount of tax relief we can to working families. And this is important. I hear from workers all the time who feel like they are still recovering from what happened during COVID, and this would help their families. And so as an economist, I share the concern about the need for broad, across-the-board tax relief and not having all those carve-outs. But the reality is, we have them. And we have them in spades in this tax code already. And so I think at least doing federal conformity helps working people in the trades, in hospitality, because they don't get some of the advantages that salaried workers get. So I think this is a very important opportunity for us to show that we are fighting for the working families of Minnesota, and I look forward to doing broader tax relief if that's the will of this committee, because I think that would be an actually much more effective and efficient way to do tax policy.
Do you want to join us here?
I'm aware I have already tanked once, but just for the purpose of this particular question, I have a lot of experience with this. I would love to share Chair David's.
Please
And
proceed.
I'm not sure of your name. One of the
And state your name for the
My
record,
name is
please.
Sandra Weiss, the owner of the Finnish Bistro on Como Avenue. What the gentleman, I don't know his name, is speaking of is that we have an issue with ownership of a tip. So when I was talking about earlier very badly about filling that gap in. It's because right now the law states that whoever hands the money to that person, the barista, they own the tip. And so everybody who attends, customers regularly think that everybody in the building splits that tip. So right now we have a disparity in the law. We need a new law for that, because that would then equal the back of the house and the front of the house. Because right now, it's the one person that the cash is handed to. That's the law. They're the owner of that tip. And so that gap could get filled if we had a law that would remove that to where it could be more tip pooling, which is, a term that not everybody likes, but that's how we could leverage it to the whole house, that somebody gives a tip and then it could go to everyone and not just the person handed the cash. But right now, that's what they have to do, and that's the law that creates this disparity.
Okay, members,
that's
we have.
in Minnesota
Talk
only.
all you'd like, because we have the room at 6 o'clock tonight. So please come back at 6 o'clock tonight, because I got a whole lot of folks want to talk on this bill yet. So Representative Smith, you have the bit, so figure 6 o'clock tonight. We are going to get, and we are going to finish Representative Joy's bill. Representative Smith.
Yep, I'll conclude here, Chair, although I'm happy to come back to talk to 6 o'clock about how we can help workers in our tax code. Because once again, Chair Rob, I don't want to talk about tip pooling because that's not within the purview of our bill here. I think that's an interesting thing to bring up. But workers at Amazon and Walmart that are working minimum wage are never going to get tips that are given to at a food establishment. So they're still going to be treated very differently. Chair Robbins, you keep saying like this is the only thing available to us, but it's just not. There's so many other ways that we could use $300 million a year. I already mentioned to you that we could increase our refundable child tax credit by $500 per child.
Representative Smith, let's stick to 3525, please.
Well, I'm comparing what the cost would bring to us.
You were talking about the child care tax credit. That's not this bill.
Okay. There are many different ways that we could spend this money besides these two particular bills and help working class families. At the end of the day, both of these bills are fronted for workers, while they ultimately, and at the end of the day, will incentivize employers to continue to use poor labor practices, incentivize long hours, and incentivize a taxing way of paying your employees where the employer does not have to pay. Just like tariffs promise smaller prices, but it's the consumers who end up paying. If we have a robust tip economy, who's paying the tip? Consumers. When they're buying the services or they're buying the food or they're buying a hotel room for the night, not the employers who are raking in millions of profit. You keep saying this is for laborers, but there are no laborers, no labor unions who are testifying for these bills because they know this is not true. It's just ownership and management who are saying these are good ideas. And workers in Minnesota know that if management and ownership are pushing things that are supposed to be for workers, probably there's a catch. And there's a lot of big catches on these bills, and they're going to handcuff us in our budget. So I am a no on both of these proposals.
Thank you, Representative Smith. Representative Wiener, I have Representative Wiener, Roach, Anderson, Lee, Kozlowski, and Warros and Gomez on this bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think we can make these comments pretty brief and get the point across without long talking. So my point is this, in this tax committee, we've seen many times exemptions for different industries. We've seen them for EVs. We've seen for chips for filmmakers in northern Minnesota that was promoted in this committee. Carve-outs are part of the tax committee. It's gone on, unfortunately, and simplifying it would be the much better case. Cutting the lowest tax bracket would be phenomenal, and that would help all workers. But since we can't do that, or haven't been able to do that, we're looking at taking and supporting a small subset of that working class. And to say that we don't want to help out our working class, I think is an affront to the people in this state who do so much for us, and to find at least some small agreement that we're going to work for them is an abomination to this tax committee. So thank you for bringing these bills forward. I think they're great, and I think they're going to help the people who have been overtaxed, the working class in the state that I stand for. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Weiner. Representative Roach.
Thank you, Chair, and thanks Representative Robbins for bringing these bills. I think, you know, conforming to federal tax, these bills are going to be great. You know, I think, you know, our colleagues on the other side of the aisle had brought up things like fairness. Well, not every taxpayer in Minnesota has a child. What's fair about that? You know, we heard things that employers are forcing employees to work overtime. The reality is people are working overtime because this state is taxing them to oblivion. It's costing them more and more and more just to live in their home and stay in their home. Our seniors are fleeing this state as tax refugees for 6 months and a day because they can't afford to be here anymore. Their Social Security is getting taxed. It's just crazy. We're trying to put money back into the hands of workers that will then put this money back into the economy. We're sitting here arguing about it as if it's not fair. They're struggling. Meanwhile, politicians come here and we work 4 days a week. We go home on Friday. That's not fair. So start doing something for the people. Put money back in their pockets so they can live a comfortable life and try to make it in this state before we lose all of them and all the businesses. COVID ravaged this state and we still haven't really came back to where we need to be. Restaurants in my district have shuttered the doors and those buildings are still empty. So let's do something about it and stop playing this political rhetoric about fairness. Let's make it fair. Let's put money in their pockets and do something for these people.
Representative Anderson.
I just want to quickly point out a couple things. There is a list that the IRS created of which people qualify for tip credit. You can find it anywhere you want. It does include, and it's very specific, that you had to be a tipped person before 24. So you can't all of a sudden try to restructure how certain jobs work. So that's very specific. Chefs happens to be on there, and cooks and dishwashers. But in Minnesota, because there's no tip pooling, they're not getting tips. And so that does create a disparity. But that's something that Minnesota should really consider because most states do that. I know Representative Smith mentioned something about it's hard for servers that he knows to keep track of their tips. Well, if they're not keeping track of their tips and claiming them, they're committing tax fraud. Most tips are through credit cards, and they're reported right to the employer, and they're supposed to report their cash tips. So they are committing tax fraud if they're not tracking their tips. I just want to, I'll leave it at that. I don't want to comment on the rest of the stuff because it was interesting discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Lee.
Thank you, Chair. So I also wanted to just clear up maybe some misconceptions. We heard from the author today that the goal of these bills is to help working class families, and I think this is an important goal that it sounds like a lot of the committee shares across party lines. So I'd like to remind the committee that we also have the power to use this money to fund the working family tax credit, which is not just a child tax credit. And every county in Minnesota actually has people who file and claim this refundable credit every year. So this already exists in Minnesota. We don't have to conform to these specific carve-outs that everyone has talked about. So thank you, Rep. Anderson, for pointing that out. I looked up that IRS list too, right? There's only like 8 designations. And so I think when we talk about wanting to get money back in people's pockets, one thing that we've learned in this committee is the best way to do that is a refundable credit, because that means that people who don't have a tax liability, who are actually low income, are able to take advantage of our state's tax dollars, right? And so we've heard about the huge price tag of these 2 bills before us, and the best way, right, is to make sure that this is targeted, and that's why you would make something of refundable credit rather than a deduction. And this already exists. It's literally called the Working Family Tax Credit. So just because you don't have kids doesn't mean you can't claim it. And so I hope if there are interested members of the public watching, this is something that you should look into in the next couple months as you work to file your personal taxes. Thank you.
Representative Kozlowski.
Thanks, Chair, and Representative and members for the discussion. I just wanted to chime in on this topic that is something I think we have a lot of people talking around and talking for poor folks, but unless you actually know what that's like, it's tough. It's tough to work these minimum wage jobs. And I also want to preface my comments that I talked to our restaurant owners, our entrepreneurs of color particularly, small businesses, they're struggling. But I agree it's notable that there are not workers or unions in the room when we're having discussions around their livelihood and their safety nets and the work that they're contributing with their hands and feet. I was the author of the minimum wage, which is what actually the union members are asking for when we look at the choices before us. The federal minimum wage, as a reminder, is $7.25, and in Minnesota, even passing the bill to equalize minimum wage and tie that to the actual cost of living is now only $11.41 as of January 1st. So I heard a lot of comments when we were passing that legislation, which is interesting to sit in the room and hear on the opposite side, because the same body of workers were discredited, undermined, relentlessly attacked, whether it's folks in hospitality, J-1 visa holders, efforts to carve out folks who are under 20 years old, why their work doesn't count the same as anybody else over 20 is mind-boggling. Cut out folks who are training. Cut out these folks who are working 2 and 3 jobs, and I think with both of these bills, whether you're working in a restaurant or you're working overtime, I shared the sentiments about, your home health, you're working childcare. I tour our childcare facilities all across greater Minnesota, and they're making the same wages as the folks in the restaurants, and sometimes even lower. And so they're working the same hours, the same grind. So equal pay for equal work, but also the same hours and time going in should also afford you a life that you can actually live and get by and not just have to survive from. So when we think about in Minnesota right now and the choices before us of no tax on tips and these other measures, I think we're having a great conversation and hope we can get around what can we do to actually raise wages for workers. As Representative Smith talked about, the $300 million that's going to cost shift this bill to Minnesota taxpayers. And I'm also highly concerned that it's another corporate subsidy. Like we talk about the folks making the lowest wages who have to work 2.5 jobs to afford a 1-bedroom home in Minnesota, a 1-bedroom apartment at that. Are the same people who are then having to foot this bill in Minnesota and shifting that to taxpayers instead of having durable wage increases coming from the employer themselves. So just a note, federally we look at if with this bill, with tipping, not taxing tips, benefits 2.5 to 5.2 million Americans, whereas raising the wage would impact 23 million, including 2.5 tipped. And just a note that the folks who wouldn't have their tips taxed at the bottom 20% are only seeing an average of $74 because 2/3 of them don't make enough income to even have to pay into taxes and to reap the benefits. And I think about people in my community, who are working these 2 and 3 jobs. We were doing a town hall a couple weeks ago, and I asked the person that was at the convention center, what are you doing the rest of the day? And he said, I got to go to my 3rd job. And I think about people like my brother working these low-wage jobs, not even enough to be able to afford a 1-bedroom home in Minnesota, let alone food and utility and car and all that. And we are pushing people into a life of of further poverty, but I will also say that this is literal life and death, and so I just want us to understand that these decisions and the way that we treat the lowest income workers is literal life and death. And, you know, it was mentioned that there could be guaranteed wage support, and I would love to see our committee take on guaranteed income. There are other choices, and this is not the choice that is a good deal for actual low-wage workers in Minnesota.
Representative Robbins?
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members. I appreciate, and our testifiers on both sides, I appreciate.
I'm sorry,
Oh.
this isn't the wrap-up. I just wanted to know if you were going to respond to that.
Oh, I was going to do it in the wrap-up. I'm trying to help us
Oh,
move
okay.
along.
You are awesome. Representative Warwas, and then Gomez,
sorry.
and then we're going to go back to Representative Robbins. Representative Warwas.
Yeah, thank you, Chair, and thank you, Representative Robbins, for bringing this bill. I don't think it's any secret to the people in this room. I'm one of those middle-class workers. I'm a third-generation miner, second-generation steelworker. I talk about it all the time. And where I work, we have 1,325 hourly employees. And I know it's been said in this room, and I know it's sometimes popular to think that you know, overtime is being forced. It's being forced. It depends on the industry. And just to your point, Representative Smith, no disrespect, in the industry that I work in, overtime is offered sometimes daily. Like in the shop that I work in right now, when I have opportunity to go there, overtime is offered very frequently. And we have people throughout our shops that are working 400, 500, 1,000 hours of overtime. And I was talking to a friend of mine a couple months ago, or not a couple months ago, last month. And he was talking about having his taxes done and how he saved about $3,000 on his federal taxes. He works a lot of overtime. He doesn't have any kids living at home. He doesn't really have a lot of places to put his money. I mean, he's paying a lot of those bills for us. He has been trying to reach that middle-class dream through his working of overtime, and he's getting waxed by the government, you know, constantly having to pay these tax bills. And I just think that, you know, we talk about, you know, having a home and owning a car and being able to afford things in the middle class. This is who I am. This is where I live, in the middle class. And to achieve that, you have to work harder. And when you work harder, you get punished. And it was also mentioned earlier that, you know, well, time and a half, like no tax on overtime, well, then people are only going to get that half time. You know, putting that out there, it's still a benefit. That half time is still a huge benefit to people like my friend Wade, who is 65 years old, retiring this month, and save money on his federal taxes. Now, if we had tax conformity in Minnesota, people could save that much more. And then they're going to put that money back into our economy, hopefully our local economy, which is also struggling. So I know it's been said, and again, no disrespect, but as to unions not being in the room, if my steelworker brothers and sisters were in this room, they'd be screaming to say no tax on overtime, because, and I hear it from them out on the floor. No tax on overtime. Wouldn't this be incredible? Because they're putting in a lot of hours, and maybe they could work a few less hours if that overtime wasn't being taxed at such a high rate. And just one more thing, it was mentioned earlier about that no tax on overtime, if that were to happen, that applies to higher income earners. That higher income is coming from them working so much overtime, much of that voluntary, but so much overtime. So to get there, to be penalized at that level, you have to put in a lot of time to do that. So these folks would really like a break, and I'd like to see it happen. Thank you for bringing this bill.
Representative Gomez.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So we're talking about $1 billion of spending here, or of foregone revenue, $1 billion. And our best estimates are that maybe 3% of our workers are tipped, maybe 6% of them ever see overtime. And so, you know, when we're talking about these amounts of money, and I think, again, like Representative Lee said, you know, we share the goals of helping out working class Minnesotans, and we recognize, I think, across our body, across, you know, both parties, that increasingly it's just really hard for a family to make a way. It's hard for people to make their rent and to make their bills. But if we're talking about spending $1 billion of public money, we have to look at that very carefully, because there are trade-offs always in these decisions that we make in these bodies. And you know, there's a lot of reasons why tax committee is the best, but honestly, one of the things for me personally, and like, just pursuing this as a policy area is like, we have principles in taxation. We have ways, a lot of times they're in conflict with one another, but we have ways to check the decisions that we're making against like a set of principles that guide building a good tax code. And we've heard about most of them through the course of today. And from what I can tell, this bill violates pretty much each and every one of them. Starting first, we've got to talk about simplicity, because I've heard in Representative Robbins's introductory comments that this is going to simplify tax preparation for people. Then I heard later in an answer to Representative Smith's question about this, that not doing this would add complexity. Respectfully, that is untrue. Adding a Minnesota-specific subtraction does not simplify our tax code. It does not simplify the process of filling out your taxes. I believe respectfully that there's some misunderstanding of above the line and below the line deductions at the federal level. So that's one of them, simplicity. Equity, there are different dimensions to equity in the tax code. We talked, Representative Kozlowski was just talking to us about vertical equity, about the distributional issues with this policy, about the fact that for the lowest income tipped workers, many of them have no tax liability, so this provides no benefit to them. That as you move up the income, scale, more and more benefits accrue to those higher income workers. Violates vertical equity, violates simplicity. Adequacy, I guess, is, you know, just like do we have enough money in our coffers? Talking about decreasing our revenues by $1 billion over the budget window here. At the same time, we're staring down, because of this exact same bill that contains this provision, from my understanding, $5 to $6 billion a year of increased costs for medical care and Medicaid in our state. Neutrality or economic efficiency, introducing economic distortions into the market, violates that one. I mean, we can go down the list. You know, I think most concerning with this is the principle of horizontal equity, which we heard many of our testifiers name specifically. And that can seem kind of disconnected, but it's like, it's those cases that Representative Smith was talking about. It's the person in the front of the house who makes $34 an hour, and the person in the back of the house who makes $20, and we're choosing winners or losers in this bill, and we're saying, even though the person in the back of the house in the same establishment cooking, you know, contributing to the same food that ends up in the same customer's plate, we're saying that the person who makes more income, that income for some reason is more worthy of a tax cut than the person who makes their income just through wages. Similarly, somebody who has access to overtime pay at their company versus someone who, this is increasingly common in our economy, we all know it, who has to work multiple jobs to make ends meet. That person gets nothing from this. If you don't have an employer that elects and it's to pay overtime, and instead they fill in their needs with part-time workers that they don't have to pay any benefits to, which is increasingly what businesses are doing, then you're choosing winners and losers there too. And so that's that principle of horizontal equity. We're supposed to treat income the same regardless of its source. We're not supposed to design our tax code in a way that picks winners and losers like that. It violates the basic principles of building a tax code that makes sense. And I've heard a lot of different descriptions of this, you know, of these components of HR 1. It's been called a gimmick. It's been called unfair. It's been called a sideshow. Temporary sugar high. That was Mr. Haveman. I like that one. This is about scoring political points. It's been called cynical. We didn't even talk about the fact that at the federal level, this expires in tax year 2028. You know what doesn't expire? The cuts to Medicaid, the cuts to health insurance, the Tax benefits for the wealthy and corporations, those don't expire after the next election. This one does. These do at the federal level. Representative Robbins makes hers permanent.
Excuse me, members, we have to shut this place down at noon because of the TV recording
Yep, I'm
stuff.
finishing up.
Oh, no, go as long as you want.
Thank you.
Tonight should be fun.
I'm here. But when you pass a bill at the federal level that cuts Medicaid, that guts health insurance, that passes that cost onto states like ours where we statutorily have to provide certain services to our residents, when you pass that on to counties and you pass that on to taxpayers, property taxpayers in all of our communities, you need a gimmick, you need a bauble, you need to put lipstick on this pig, and so that's what this is. And so we should absolutely not conform with these components of HR 1, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Thank you. Does the department have a position? Okay. Representative Robbins, if you would wrap it up quick. I like your bill, by the way, but if you could wrap it up.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members and testifiers. It was a very good discussion. I would just like to say that my preference is not to do these carve-outs. My preference is to cut taxes for everybody. And that is the most efficient, effective thing we can do to our tax code. But given that, I know there's been a lot of discussion of why this isn't refundable. And we have a lot of refundable credits in our tax code already. And members, this is an attempt to try to help the middle class, because they are the ones who get hit every time when those cliffs happen and they are left out of all the tax preferences that generally our tax code leans into. And so we are trying to help workers who are in all these industries where they get tips, where they have the opportunity for overtime, trade workers, nurses, first responders, manufacturing, construction, and service sector employees. We are trying to help them have more money in their pockets, and that's what this is about. If there was ability to cut taxes for everyone across the board, I would certainly endorse that over these bills. But in lieu of that, members, we should conform with federal tax on no tax on overtime and tips, because workers really are looking to us to help them out, and this is an obvious way to do it. Thank you, members.
Thank you. And Representative Robbins renews her motion to lay House File 3525 over for possible inclusion in the omnibus tax bill. Thank you, Representative Robbins. Thank you, members.